Welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join John and I on the Best Practices for New Form Builders webinar. Before we jump into any of the material, we always like to go through some of the announcements. The first one being that in September, we have the 2017 Zerion Power User Summit. With this, we have linked to the Power User Summit in this webinar, but we'll also make sure we give access to it to you within our follow-up email. The Power User Summit is a great time for customers to come together and learn from each other, as well as see what's coming from the Zerion team and see to actually put a face with the name as far as our Zerion team members. Not only is this a great time to learn from each other, but it's also a great time to educate yourself on more of the platform. We offer 2 certification sessions before the Power User Summit, one being Data Flow Automation and the other being the Form Builder certification. After the Power User Summit, we have set it up so that there are some meetings, but we also have free trainings on Zerion documents and Zerion reports. So I highly suggest that you check out the Power User Summit and see if you can attend. As far as the Form Builder certifications going, the next session we have is actually a recertification, as well as we often think of it as advanced form building. This is going to be held on August 29th and 31st, and it is done online. I highly suggest that you, if you have been Form Builder certified, you check the date that you were Form Builder certified and see if you're ready for that recertification to take place. And then for upcoming webinars on the 26th, we have our Esri and Zerion webinar, where we're going to talk through the relationship that we have with the Esri platform and how to connect iForm Builder with and Zerion products with Esri. On the 2nd of August, we have the Zerion Spotlight and Customer Solutions. If you're a customer interested in presenting on that webinar, please let us know. We are still looking for presenters, and if you're someone who's built out a dynamic solution, we'd love to hear it and share it with the world. And the last webinar that we have is on August 17th, and that's how do I debug this form. So after today's session, where we go through some of the fundamentals of form building, this is a great way to build upon your knowledge in August on how to debug the form. Before I hand it over to John, we do have 2 polls that I'd like to quickly launch to kind of get a good feel of our customers and attendees today. The first one is about your experience with form building. So if you could go ahead and respond to that poll, that would be great. Okay. So John, it looks like we've got a pretty good mix, but most people are either relatively new or if they have been building more basic forms. We do have some individuals who have been building those advanced forms with smart controls. So we hope to gather or get everyone's attention and make sure that they're following those best practices after today's session. So with that, I'll go ahead and close this poll and then launch our second poll, which is a quick one on just where have you been building your forms. So for those of you who've been building forms for a while now, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that we have our classic form builder interface as well as our newest form builder interface. Today, and all of our trainings usually go through the newest form building interface, but it is helpful to know if anyone is still using the classic version. And John, it looks like it's about 50-50 on that response. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Barrett. So what we're going to be talking about today is I'm going to be going over these 5 topics with respect to them being best practices for new form builders. The first thing we're going to be looking at is learning and understanding each of the different form building elements. After that, we're going to talk about how option lists are organized and how you want to best use them in your forms. Then we're going to transition into talking about subforms and do the same thing. We'll talk about what subforms are, knowing when you want to use subforms and how to best take advantage of them. This 4th bullet is going to be where we'll talk about setting up an effective workspace. Now, this isn't necessarily a best practice or a form building technique, but setting up an effective workspace is going to be really, really important to make sure that you can build forms in a timely manner, and it's going to really speed up your development. And then the last thing I want to talk about is making changes to live forms. I always make sure to include this on webinars focusing on new form builders because of the the damages you can do to your data and your forms by making certain changes to certain properties. So I always keep this in here. In fact, it's even one of our golden rules that we talk about anytime we do onboarding for Zerion customers or we do kickstarts for iForm Builder customers. So we'll start off by talking about the different form building elements that are available to you. Now there's a lot of different elements that you can use. If I talked about each one individually, it would take up the entire time of the webinar, so I don't want to do that. But what I do like doing is presenting them as a set of 6 different categories. You can see them outlined here. Starting in the upper left, you have your standard form building elements, and then moving counterclockwise is the order we're going to be going through these. So we'll start with standard, then move on to enhancement, scanning and hardware, masking, appearance, and then finally we'll have a discussion around option-based elements. Now when it comes to standard elements, I categorize these elements as the ones that are going to mimic a normal data collection process. And when I say normal, I'm really speaking towards traditional pen and paper data collection. Things like writing down the date, the time, having a generic text element, or a numeric field, or even a signature. These are all things that you would see on a normal paper form. Now, because there's not a whole lot to these elements, what I like to do instead is talk about why you want to choose a specific element. And this is really going to set the context for the remaining categories. So when you're deciding which element to use for your data collection, you want to first keep in mind the field inspectors themselves. You want to try to use an element that will be intuitive for them to use, that'll be easy for them to use. You also want to make sure that they're going to be limited in what they can do. You don't want to give them the ability to type in any character when you know it's going to be a numeric value. That dovetails very nicely into the second bullet I have here, where you want to reduce the opportunities for incorrect data entry. Using a numeric field instead of a text element is one way you could do that. You could also look at things like using a zip code element instead of just a normal numeric element, because a zip code is going to make you adhere to a certain mask or a certain format. Ideally, if you can, you would want to choose an element that's going to automate the data collection. That's going to be a best case scenario. The easiest example I have for that is using the location element, where it's going to automatically grab all of the GPS data for you, and it will store it in that one element. That makes doing the data collection much easier for the data collector. They don't have to log each of the individual latitude, longitude, and all the different properties. This fourth bullet is really important as well. You want to be able to homogenize or standardize your data. Now, the example I always like to use here is if you are recording an address and you want to record the state that the person is from. Now, if you have a normal text element as a standard element to capture that, you don't know if they're going to spell out the entire state's name. They may use an abbreviation. They might capitalize certain parts or have it all lowercase. You're not sure about the exact formatting of your data, and that can cause headaches later on down the line when you're trying to standardize your data and use it to process. Finding ways and finding elements that are going to keep your data homogenized or in the same format is going to improve your workflows, and it'll make it a little bit faster for you once you start to do actionable things with your data. And finally, you want to be able to choose elements that are going to minimize unnecessary interactions with the form. So for example, going back to the location element, doing that is going to require the data collector to not do as many things to get all the information. Additionally, you can think of the counter element compared to the number element, where with the number you have to input the actual numeric value, whereas with a counter you'll have plus minus buttons that you can choose to make sure you keep it at a whole number count. I also want to highlight the read-only element as an element that will appear like a text element, but you cannot actually edit the value. Again, it's going to minimize the interaction that the data collector has with the form. Moving on to our enhancement elements, these are going to be elements that take advantage of the fact that you're on a mobile device, that being either a cell phone or a tablet. Now, the biggest advantage that we see, and the most commonly one that is used, is the fact that you can take pictures. So looking at the image element or the drawing element, both of those are excellent. I always like to highlight the differences between the two because they sound very similar. So with an image, all you're going to be doing is taking a picture or selecting a picture from your device. Whereas with the drawing element, you're able to actually add a layer to that image and draw on top of it. That can be really useful for highlighting important parts of the image. We see people do inspections and take pictures of whatever they're inspecting, circle areas of damage, things like that.
So, John,
Yep.
with that one, is there any best practices you have on when someone should use an image versus when they should use the drawing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely if they want to add some sort of an annotation to the drawing, I think that's when you would want to use it. The other thing to keep in mind is going back to the idea about keeping your data collectors in mind. It really speaks more to actually the strength of the connection. Your drawing elements can get pretty significant in size because each time you annotate on it, you're adding a layer to that drawing. So what you're really doing is you're actually syncing like 5 images for one element. So that can be another consideration. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that, Barrett?
No, I think you're right. I think a good consideration is when the size of the drawing element versus the image element when you do have a lot of layers.
Definitely.
Thank you.
No problem. So some of the other elements I like to highlight here, the subform element is one that I like to highlight primarily because we're going to be talking about it in one of the next bullets when we talk about when to use subforms. But that's going to be an allowance you have or a feature that you have working within iForm Builder or Data Collector. And then the last one I'll mention is the assign to element. This is an element that will actually let you take that data that you have collected, what we call a record, and you can actually assign that record data to another user who has access to the form. We see this very commonly used when we have a field inspector assign the record to their supervisor for review. Similarly, the supervisor could assign the record back to the field inspector if they need to make edits or they need to make adjustments or go back and revisit the site. Now, this third category of elements are our scanning and hardware elements. These are going to be elements that capture data automatically, whether that's through an external collection device, such as a temperature probe or the socket scanner, or what it can do is it can capture the data through the camera using the ManityWorks element and scanning barcodes. The ManityWorks element is one that we see used very commonly. It allows you to select one of many different symbologies, which are going to be the different types of barcodes. For example, a QR code, a driver's license, and a book are all going to have very different types of barcodes. So you want to be able to set what type of barcode you want to have scanned. For those form builders who are a little bit more experienced, I always like to highlight the possibility of combining a scanning element with Smart Table Search, and that's going to give you an automatic way to look up data. If you think about being at a grocery store, when you scan the barcode, it will automatically look up data such as price and description and item name for that, whatever you're buying, whatever got scanned. You can mimic that functionality inside of your form. Barrett, I real quickly did want to pause. It looks like we have someone raising their hand and maybe a question as well.
I'm not sure about the question. I'm gonna, or the person raising their hand.
Okay.
I'll get back to see if they actually want audio rights. But as far as the question that came in, there's a question on if there's any plan on building an NFC technology as an element.
That is a good question, actually. I'm not sure. Barrett, do you have any knowledge about that?
I am not sure about any plans for that, but maybe there is, and it's just not on our radar. I would suggest to this individual, if this is something that you're looking towards, please make sure you add this request or this suggestion within our Customer Success Center and our community forum.
Definitely. Okay. Were there any other questions before I move forward?
I think we're doing pretty well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so this fourth type of element or category of element are our masking elements. Now, I mentioned the zip code earlier, and a zip code is going to follow a relatively standard format of 5 numeric values, followed by an optional 4 numbers at the end. So setting up that format is what we call a mask. And you'll see in the table below, if you want the character at that position to be numeric, you could use the pound symbol. So if I wanted to set up a mask for a zip code, it would look something along the lines of 5 required numbers, a hyphen, and then you'll see here you can do optional numeric characters as well, 4 optional characters afterwards. You set up your mask, and then anytime someone is filling out the form, the value that goes in that element has to adhere to the mask you create. Now the zip code, social security number, and phone elements all have a standard mask associated to them initially. What I do want to highlight is that the social security number element is going to be the most flexible of the 3. And so anytime you want to have a custom mask, we always recommend that you use that element in order to do so. Now, our 5th category is probably the simplest of all 5 of them, or all 6 of them, I'm sorry. But the appearance elements are going to be purposed with improving the experience of the data collector by adding spacing to your form, as well as the ability to add additional instructions. So if you have a divider element, what that's going to do is it's going to include a horizontal line in your form. Now that divider element does not actually collect data, it's only meant there as an aesthetic in order to break up a list of elements and help the data collector keep track of where they are. That can be really beneficial, especially for long lists of questions that all look very similar. Your label element is going to give you text instructions that you can add to your form. We'll see this commonly used for step-by-step instructions on how the data collector is supposed to collect their actual data. You can use this as a reference for certain thresholds or numbers to determine what grade something is going to receive. We've also seen labels used as long blocks of text for things like consent forms, where they'll put that text in there for the data collector to be able to read out loud for the respondent. Now, for these elements, because they don't actually collect any data, they will not be included in your email reports that are generated when you collect records. But if you wanted to, you could add a reference ID in order to include them. Conversely, on the other hand, if you have elements that you want to skip inside of your report, you can do that by adding the reference ID element skip report, as you see below. Now, finally, let's talk about our option-based elements. And I always save these for the end because I think that they are going to be the best type of element you can get to and use for your data collection. Working with option-based elements is going to allow you to standardize your data because you're choosing from a predefined list. For those people who are brand new to form building, an option list is going to be a set of values that the user can choose from for a given element. Now, there's 3 main types of elements that are going to be option-based. You have your select element, your pick list, and your multi-select. Now I have this decision chart down below because it can be difficult sometimes to choose which element you want to use, and a lot of times people tend to gravitate towards one, not knowing that the other 2 are available to them. So the first decision you have to make is if you want to be able to choose only one value from your option list, or if you want the ability to choose multiple values from your option list. Think of that as a question that's going to prompt you to say choose all that apply. Or if you want to choose more than one location for something, you can choose multiple values in your option list. If that's the scenario, then you have to use a multi-select element. It is the only option-based element where you can choose more than one value. Now, if you are going to choose only a single value, the next thing you have to ask is whether your option list is a short list or a long list. Now, depending on the device type you are using, as well as the resolution of it, the determination for a short and long list can vary. For phones, I would say don't exceed 4 options for a short list, whereas on a tablet, you can probably get up to 6 without losing any of the text or having the form display in a bad way. So things like selecting yes, no, not applicable, or choosing from a small set of states, or from a shorter list of options that's going to be when you want to use select. The reason being a select element is going to show inline and it's going to be faster to fill out. So going back to that initial consideration about thinking about with keeping your data collectors in mind. On the other hand, your pick list is going to be ideal for longer lists. For one, it's going to open up a second window that you'll be able to scroll through to quickly find the value you want. If your list is really long, you can even search for your value inside of the pick list. And we see that used. We see people who have thousands of options inside of their pick list or inside of their option list. And so a pick list is going to be the ideal element for them to use. Now, before I transition into talking about option lists and specifically using their key values, Barrett, I wanted to check in. Are there any questions that people have asked that I could answer?
So there was a question about the element reference IDs and using those to have elements being skipped in reports.
Okay.
And so I think we are all set with that, but it's just knowing that those some of the element reference IDs, one's to skip all the reports, one to just skip the email and PDF, and one's to actually have those elements added to reports.
Great, that's really good information. Thank you, Barrett.
Sure.
All right, so now I want to talk about option lists, how they're structured since they were part of the different elements, and then how you're going to best utilize them. So your option list is going to have three key properties to it. You're going to have a label, a key value, and a sort order. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the classic builder, the sort order has replaced what we called an index before. The reason we've renamed it is in the new builder, you're actually able to rearrange options in an option list, which was something that could not be done before very easily. Now, for your label and your key value, the primary distinction is that the label is what the data collector will see on their device. So if they open up an option-based element, they would see the label text there. The key value, on the other hand, is what will be stored in the table when you submit your record. So if you see with the option list I have below, if I were to choose the option for very good, that is what I would have seen on my screen. That's what I would have pressed on. However, the number 4 is what would actually get saved in the table. Now, the good news is you have access to both the label, the key value, and in addition, the sort order. You can access each one of these properties using the table below. For this table, we're working under the assumption that the data column name of the element is called rating. So if I wanted to get the sort order of that option that was chosen, I would just use the data column name standalone by itself. That would return the value 1 for what I chose. Now, if I wanted to return the options label, I would say ZC display value underscore rating, again, rating being the data column name. That would return very good. And then finally, if I wanted to have the key value, I would say ZC display key underscore rating, and that would give me the key value. Now, when it comes to writing your smart controls, which are going to be additional functionalities that you can add to your forms to make them more dynamic, we always recommend that you use the key value for any sort of logic. The reason being your key value is going to be the least likely to change, thus it will be the least likely to break your smart controls. I can give you examples for each between the sort order as well as the label and when they might change. Now imagine if I have the same option list, but I want to go ahead and include this in a form where the data collectors speak Spanish. So I'm going to add localization on top of my form, and that is going to change the label text. So at this point, if I have smart controls based on that label, then they're not going to match up anymore because the actual text is different. Moreover, a lot of times what we see is people will get feedback from their data collectors saying, hey, this label didn't make sense to me. Could you change it to this text? And so because the label is the outward facing text, it tends to be changed the most often. Any of those changes would then require a modification in your smart controls. When it comes to the sort order, if you use a sort order for your conditions, and for your smart controls, that alone is actually going to take away the opportunity for you to rearrange your option list a lot of the time. If you're using the index, and this is a very common practice, especially for people who are familiar with the classic builder, they'll use the index value for all their smart controls. But then what that means is you don't have the ability or the opportunity to change the ordering of your options. So for those two reasons, I always recommend to use the key value when it comes to smart controls. You would do that again by saying ZC display key underscore, the data column name, and then you could search for a value here. You could do a comparison. Now the third bullet here, the third thing I want to talk through is subforms. Before I can talk about why you would want to use subforms, it's important to understand what they are and the function that they serve. So a subform is going to be an element that you add to your form. Inside of that element, it's going to reference to a different form. That's going to be called a child form. What happens is as you're filling out your data, you get to that subform element, and when you select it, it's going to open up an instance of your child form for you to fill out. Now, the reason we use the word parent and child is because those two forms are inherently associated at this point. The child form is spawned off of the parent form. Now, there's two main ways that you are able to establish that connection from child to parent and parent to child. The first way is if you want to see your subform being a section or as a shared form. In both scenarios, your subform would only be filled out a single time per parent record. The example I have here in the screenshots below are if I have an inspection form and I need to collect the location information about the site, I can use this form for my address, my city, my state, and my zip code. Now, if I have another form that's going to be for new employees, I need the same type of information before a mailing address this time. I can connect the subform to both of these forms, and the records will still be organized. Now, the second reason you would want to use a subform is if you're planning on taking that set of information and filling it out repeatedly over and over again per parent. That's going to be what's called a one-to-many relationship, where you can take that form, fill it out 0, 1, or many times. In the screenshots you see below, I have my inspection form that I was taking screenshots with, and I may need to replace multiple items. So in this scenario, I'm going to fill out my subform for every item that needs to be replaced. I'm going to supply the item's name. That's going to populate what type of an item it is, and then I'll choose a quantity, and that will calculate the total cost. What you'll see is for every record I create, it's going to be stored inside of that subform as an individual record. Barrett, I did want to check in now that I've gone through the elements, option lists, and subforms before I go into talking about my workspace and then actually building out some forms for everybody.
John, so far I think people are feeling pretty good about what you've talked about. There have been some other questions about using large option lists and that impact on devices. If you want to add anything else about that and how that initial sync may be a little bit longer, then that's fine. Otherwise, I think we're good.
Sure. So when you do have a large option list, understand that when you sync your device, you're pulling all that information down onto your device locally from the server. Now, what Barrett was alluding to was that initial download can be fairly long because you're grabbing all those records, but you are able to apply an option list ID, or I'm sorry, a reference ID to your option list that would index those values, and it would speed up subsequent syncs afterwards. All right, so next what I want to do is I want to talk about my workspace a little bit. I'm going to tell you some of the things that I do when I go ahead and start building out forms, and then I'm actually going to model some of these behaviors and build out a really basic sample form for everybody today. So when speaking about our workspace, I wanted to talk about two different axes or two different views that you're able to have. So these are 4 different screenshots from my workspace as I develop forms. We're first going to talk about this bottom left and the upper right because they are on opposing sides. You're going to see one or the other. And then we'll do the same thing for the upper left and the lower right. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between working on your form and then working on an option list. Now, if I load up my work environment here, I'm going to open up my form builder. And you'll see that this is going to load up forms, and this is highlighted here. Now, if I want to go and manage my option list, I can click over here, and that's going to load a list of option lists that I've created. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is that I personally prefer to work inside of the option list manager. It's going to give you a couple more choices in terms of how you build out your option list. But even more importantly than that is the idea of opening up multiple tabs. So I'm going to go back to pretending I just opened up my form builder. And now I know that I need to develop an option list. I need to create one or edit one. Instead of opening it in this current browser tab that I'm in, I'm actually going to right click on here and open this in a new tab. So now what I can do is I can jump back and forth between working on a form and working on an option list. I found this to be a tremendous time saver when I develop my forms. In a similar vein, when you're working on a data collection project that has multiple forms, for example, I have a parent form here and a child form here, you're going to want to open up each one of them separately. So I'm going to first open my parent form. I'm then going to right click on forms, open this in another tab, so I can then open my child form. And at this point, I have my workspace set up the way I like to operate. I have my parent form here. You'll see there's a subform, which is this form. And then finally, any option lists that I need to work on will be available here as well. Now going all the way back to my first tab, don't forget that I am still inside of my iForm Builder environment. So as I'm submitting records, I can go to my data tab and check to make sure that they, one, made it into that table, and then two, I can also look at the data that was eventually synced to the server. Now what I want to do for this webinar is go ahead and build out a form. Now what I want to do is start with a new form. So I'm going to go back here, click on Create Form. I'm going to go ahead and call this form July Webinar. Now you'll notice that the table name mirrors what I have for my form label, except it's lowercase and has underscores. What I want to do is I'm going to uncheck based on label because I want to add an underscore P to this form to signify that it's a parent form. I'm going to scroll down and create my form. And in here now, I'm able to add elements to this. Now before I move forward with the actual building of my form, I want to jump back and talk about the other axis here, which is going to actually be a difference in views. So this is the other thing that I consider with my workspace. When you're building forms, you're going to have two different views that you can use. You can use what's called the device view in the upper left, which you saw me load into. And there's also a table view that you can use that you see in the lower right. Each view is going to have its strengths and its weaknesses. And I want to show you what they are based on how I go through my workflow. So while I'm here and I've created this form, the first thing I want to do is go ahead and add a text element. I'm going to do that by scrolling down on the left-hand side, finding the element named text, and just clicking on it. And it will add it to my form. Now I'm able to modify the label as well as the data column name initially. I'm going to go ahead and call this full name. Now I want my label to be similar to that, but it doesn't have to be exact. And in fact, I cannot have a space in my data column name, so I will use an underscore. At this point, this is another thing I'm going to do and that I do quite frequently. I'm going to save right away. So one of the other things I like to do with my form building is not only the idea of saving right away, but it's also the idea of testing your form frequently. What you don't want to try to do is try to build out an entire form, cross your fingers, sync your device, and hope it works. That's not going to set you up for success. Instead, what you want to do is build your form incrementally. Add a couple of elements, 2 to 3. If you're really comfortable with your form building, you can add more. But then save and test as frequently as you can, because this way, when you eventually do run into a problem, you'll know how to debug it, and it'll be a little bit easier. In fact, as a sneak preview, your development cycle, or what I call your feedback and your testing cycle, is one of the best practices I have for the webinar on debugging your forms. It's one of the techniques I suggest, and it's a very simple one, just to save your form frequently and then to test it as often as you can. Now what I want to do next inside of this form is I want to go ahead and add an option-based element to it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an option list for choosing whether it's a boy or a girl. And so what I will do is switch over to my option list manager now, and I'll be able to create a new list. I'm going to call this option list boy or girl. I will create it. And this is going to load up the option list manager. Now in this view, this is where you can explicitly type out your labels as well as your key values, and you can do this one item at a time. So for example, if I have boy, and I add this action here, now I've added this option to my option list. If I click on the plus sign, I can add another one. Now you'll notice that the key value is going to mimic the label. A lot of the times that's going to be the behavior that you want to have happen. Sometimes I would also recommend making your key value database friendly. Since it is what it will be stored in the database table, it helps to keep it be database friendly because often you will be using that to integrate with another service. Let me go ahead and confirm this addition, and then you'll see that these colors are yellow. I'm going to save this, and it will turn white to let you know that those saves have now been finalized. I'm next going to go back over to my form builder. I'm going to add a select element. Now the reason I want to add a select element, again going back to my decision tree, is that my option list is very short. It was just boy or girl. I'm going to set up my label as well as my data column name. Scroll down here, click on my option list button, and I'm going to search for my option list to assign. Now again, because I've been talking through my building of the form, it's taking me a little bit longer than it normally does, so I'm just going to go ahead and save again. All right, and I'm ready to move on. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add a date element here. Okay. Now my intention is that the date element should be populated automatically, and so we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm going to write today's date. Now initially what I would want to do, and it is kind of a reflex or at least an instinct, is to name this data column date. It makes sense, it's clear, it's short and concise. The problem with this is that you're unable to have your data column names be words that are on our reserved word list. And if you've been on the Customer Success Center before, you'll be able to search for and find that list of reserved words. Now in the event I try to save this form like this, it's going to give me an error. It's going to say, hey, this name is a reserved word, you can't use this. You want to learn more about it? Let's click on this link. And hey, here we go. We get our Customer Success Center article with all the words that we're not allowed to use. Now, it's not that date cannot be included in the data column name. It's just that it cannot be the standalone value. So that's why I'm going to do something like this, date_today. I'm going to go ahead and save this form. And we have no problem saving. Now again, for those of you who are experienced with the classic builder, if you've ever done this and tried to make a form that has an element with a reserved word as a data column name, it actually puts you in an infinite loop where you can no longer save your form, but you won't notice it until you try to make a save later on. So what we hear quite frequently is that people will lose work over that because they're unable to save. In this new builder, that's not an issue, and so this is probably going to be one of those golden rules or small little tips and tricks that I'll slowly stop mentioning. But for those of us who are still in transition towards the new form builder, I wanted to highlight that as a key feature or improvement in the new builder compared to the classic. Now the last thing I'm going to do is add a read-only element to this form. And what I want this form to be is, or what I want this element to show, is the username for the person who is logged in. So I can say something like submitted by, and the intention here is I'm going to put in my actual iForm Builder username. Now I chose a read-only element because I don't want the data collector to be actually able to change this. This should be something that is shown. It should be something that cannot be modified. So that's the decision to use a read-only element. To recap so far, we've talked about the difference between the form builder side of things and then as well as the option list manager. Now in the form builder here, you want to use this because you're able to open up multiple tabs for each form you're working on. We want to make sure we name our parent forms and child forms differently. If you remember, I added an _P to the end of my form because I knew it was going to be a parent. And then finally, the other nice thing is we can modify form properties using the table view below. So if I jump back to this view, oops, let me go ahead and save this. If I jump back to this view, you're able to choose what is shown in this table. So for example, I may want to go and look at reference ID 5. Reference ID 5, for those of us who are unfamiliar, is going to be a reference ID responsible for handling the aesthetics of your form build or your iForm or your data collector homepage. So you can change things like the color of the form's label or the color of the info bar or the color of the border. A lot of the times what we'll do is we'll have a set of forms that we want to style in one way. Instead of opening each form individually, changing the properties, saving it, and opening the next one, you can quickly do something, whoops. You can quickly go through this table here. Let me go back to my form builder. I'll show this 5th reference ID. And I can edit a row, copy this, edit a row, paste it here, confirm it, and it'll be saved. So this is going to be a very quick way to make changes to multiple forms that you want. Now going back into here, if I look at my option list manager, that's going to give me more ways to create option lists. I showed you how to do it one option at a time, but in fact there are more ways to do it that are actually going to be more efficient. So if we go back to the option list I had, if I actually had a long set of data that I wanted to just copy and paste into here, I wouldn't want to type this out manually one at a time. Instead, what I would do is I would click on the upload button, and I can use what's called a raw upload. This is going to function very similar to the classic builder, where you would enter in one option per line. So I could do that here. I could say something like this: boy, girl. And then once I upload this, each one of those will become an option in my option list. Now, for example, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a couple of states in here. So I'll say Virginia, Maryland, DC, New York, Florida, California. So I have my list of options as raw text. I can insert it at the bottom of my option list or at the top, or anywhere in the middle. But most importantly, I actually want to empty my option list. I want to get rid of that boy, girl, and replace the current options. I'll click on upload, and you'll see I now have my option list with each of these set up. So that's going to be a really fast way for you to import a large set of data here. The main takeaway is that using the raw upload, your data is very similar. It cannot be too complex. For complex data, for data that is going to use condition values, what we call segmented option lists, I recommend the CSV upload. You can download an example template here, open this up, and this is going to allow you to leverage the power of spreadsheeting software such as Excel. And I can set up my label, my key value, my condition value in a sort order. So if I take that same list of states I had before, Virginia, Maryland, DC, New York, California, Florida. I can set a key value for these. Now, if I want them to mimic, I could type it out manually like I just did, but that's going to be a little bit too slow. So I can leverage this being Excel, and I can do something like this and create formulas and populate fields, 0, 1, and then I'll say this is going to be D2, plus 1. So I can fill those all in. Now for my condition value, this is where I'm able to set criteria so that if the criteria is met, then those options will be shown. If the criteria is not met, meaning it evaluates to false, then the options are going to be hidden. Now I could have something that says, residence equals north, and that might be for, copy this, New York. Residence may equal mid. We'll use this for New York or for Virginia and Maryland and DC. This could be west. And finally, this last one could be south. So the implication here is that I have another element in my form called residence, and depending on its value, some or all of these options would be shown. Now once I have this option list done, I can go ahead and save this as a CSV file. And I can upload my file by attaching it first. I'm going to empty out my table just like I did before, and then finally click on upload. And you'll see here my label, key value match, and if I go to condition value, you see that these are established as well. Now, the final thing I want to speak to is ultimately when we make changes to our live forms, what we have to do. Now there's two things I want to go through. The first thing is an actual enhancement, and then the second thing is going to be steps you want to make to ensure that you're not losing data. So the first enhancement here as I load up my form is that I'm going to leave my device view and I'm actually going to switch by clicking up here to my list view. Now my list view is going to be a table, and it's going to allow you to do things like hide the label text because it's already been set, and I can include my dynamic and my condition values. Now for those of you who have played around with smart controls a good amount, I love this view for working with smart controls. I'm able to take the data column name, copy it, and paste it over here. I'm able to look at my form and see more elements on the screen. This view is perfect for setting up and configuring each individual element. What I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the date to be a new date, so that means it's going to take today's date. For submitted by, I'm going to use one of the iForm Builder built-in functions for their username. Also, because I don't want them to change the date, I'm going to set this to false, meaning that the element will always be hidden. Once I make these changes here, I can save this, and you'll see that the changes have been confirmed. Now the other thing I want to make note about this view is I know I've been running into a small bug lately where sometimes the sort order will not update properly when I'm in the device view. One of the things I found to alleviate that pain point is to come in here and manually change my sort order. So imagine if this was mixed up and it said there were two sort order 3s. I could then come in and say, hey, I don't want this one to be sort order 3. I want this to show up before submitted by. Let's change this to a sort order of 2. Save my form. So you can make changes very quickly here as well, and you're going to be able to fix that sort order bug also. Now the last part about this making changes to your live forms are those steps to prevent data loss. When you're making changes to a live form, you're able to change some of the properties, such as the label and the dynamic or the data column name. However, you cannot change the element's type, its data size, meaning the length of text, or whether that element is encrypted or not. If either of these three properties are changed, what happens is in the back end, the change is drastic enough where it cannot do an update. It can't just rename the column. It actually has to delete the column and recreate it. Now, while that process may seem like it's instantaneous to you as the end user, or it's seamless, what actually is happening is any data that's in that column would get deleted as well. And so that's where we see the data loss. To avoid doing this, to make sure that your data is safe when changing properties, I have this table or a list compiled for you. You're able to change the label without a problem. You're able to change the data column name without a problem. These are the three you cannot change. Dynamic and condition values are fine to change. And I have both selected for assigned option list and assigned lookup table. The reason this is set up this way is because you're able to actually change the assignment, and it's not going to delete the column, it's not going to delete the data. The problem is both of these properties, or both of these smart controls, use a identifier to point to the option list in which it was selected. If you change the option list or you change the lookup table that's being used, that identifier may not point to the correct data anymore. So while you're not losing data, in a sense, your data has almost been corrupted. Now, all of this is great to say, don't change your element type, don't change your data size or your encryption, but ultimately forms need to be updated. Ultimately, your projects will adapt and will grow, and you have to modify that form. When that's the case, you want to make sure you follow these steps that I'm going to outline to prevent losing data. The first thing you want to do is duplicate that element. So in this scenario, for these screenshots, you'll see I have an element called age set to a text element. That doesn't make sense because the age should be numeric. So what I want to do ultimately is have the age be a numeric value. I'm going to start by duplicating this. So now I have age and age1, which is also a text element. All the configurations for my original element are saved here as well. The only thing you see that was changed was the label in the data column name, because they have to be unique. After that's done, I'm going to modify or adjust my new element. You'll see here I changed the data type to a number. I also changed my label so it matches what I had before. This is because our last step is to disable the original element. Once an element is disabled, it will not show up on any reports, it will not collect any new data, and it will not be used in any smart controls. But the column is not gone. It's almost like it's being archived. You still have it inside of your table, thus you still have all of your data. So again, the process is going to be to duplicate the element, to adjust it, and then to finally disable the original. Now, Barrett, before I get into a recap of this webinar, I wanted to again check in with you to see if there are any questions I could answer.
Actually, you covered some of them naturally. One of them was about going into the table view and the editing of the sort order. So I think we're all set. Thank you, John.
Perfect. So to recap this webinar today, I wanted to talk about some of these form building fundamentals. These are going to be best practices as a new form builder. The first thing is, of course, you want to learn each element, right? Those elements are going to be tools in your toolkit. So knowing the different elements you have at your disposal is going to be beneficial to creating a form that is as robust as possible. The second recommendation I have is to use key values for option lists whenever possible. That is because your key value is going to be the least likely property to change relative to the label as well as the sort order. Third, you want to make sure you master the use of subforms. Subforms are a defining characteristic of working within iForm Builder or in Zerion Data Collector. Understanding how to use them best is going to give you the best data collection experience possible. My fourth recommendation here is that you want to start with your device view and then move to the table view as you're building your forms. What I normally do is in the device view, I will add all the elements I need to have for a section. Then I'll switch over to the table view and actually make the adjustments and the configurations to them. And then finally, the last recommendation I have is to properly update your forms. Don't change that element type. Don't change your encryption or your data size because you will lose records that way. Additionally, like I was doing during this demo, I'm saving frequently. I'm making sure I don't do too much in one step. Now, to go a little bit deeper for each one of these also, I have a best practice for defining a naming convention. You want to use that _P or _C for a parent form or child form. And then for more experienced form builders who are using Smart Table Search, _DB as well. The second best practice is that you want to map out your form before building it. If you saw the way I was building the form, I kind of went back and forth. I made part of the form, I made an option list, I added it to the form. That can be okay, but honestly, when you're building out larger forms in real meaningful projects, it gets confusing. Map out your process, know what steps you want to build in, and have a plan. Third, make sure you don't forget those data collectors. I've mentioned them throughout the webinar because they are ultimately the ones who will be using your form, and collecting proper data hinges on their ability to collect the data in the form in a correct manner. So don't forget the data collectors, ask for their feedback on the label text, make sure that they are comfortable using the software and that they've tested the forms thoroughly before you roll it out live. Because once you test your forms and then once it goes live, you're going to be limited in the changes you can make. That goes back to the idea of updating your forms. My final best practice, and it's something that I showed briefly, but you want to use that CSV upload for your option lists. You'll notice that this is underlined. That's because this is going to be a link to our Customer Success Center on an article on how to do this. Using CSV files to manage your option list is one of the biggest changes I've made in my form building as of recent. Right now, there's no way for you to download an option list. And so if you think about having a very lengthy list that you need to make changes to, sometimes it's hard to make changes in the manager. What you really want to do is be able to get all the data, use the power of spreadsheeting software to manipulate it, and then re-upload it. The only issue is it's hard to get that data down to begin with. So if you start with a CSV file, then when you need to make changes to that option list eventually, you make changes to the CSV file you already had and you re-upload it. Okay. Just as a reminder, I want to let everybody know that in addition to these webinars, we are always going to be there for you. Feel free to join in on our chat and join in on the community forums. Our Customer Success Center is always going to have an ever-increasing number of knowledge-based articles that you can read, that you can reference during your form building. Barrett also mentioned Form Builder recertification. We also offer certification as well. So if you want to get formal training from us on making sure that you hit certain competencies and you have a strong, diverse skill set in your form building, definitely be sure to check out those certifications. It's a really great way to have some structured learning and some formal instruction on how to use the platform. And then ultimately, if your needs are going to be very complex, it's not something that you want to invest the time into learning how to do, we do offer project services so that we can accompany you and partner with you to build out the solution that you're looking for. I want to go ahead and thank everybody for joining this webinar. Like it says up here, in the next 48 hours, you're going to be receiving an email with access to a recording of the session, as well as a session PDF. The third thing that I want to note is that you'll also be added to Zerion Academy if you do not currently have a user there already, and that's going to allow you to easily access an archive of old webinars, and then it also is our central repository for all training material. Barrett, last chance, last opportunity for any final questions from the audience.
We're all set as far as questions. I do want to just remind people that after today's session, when we close the GoToWebinar, you will see a poll. If you guys don't mind responding to those questions, that's always a huge help. You'll also get those questions in an email, and so responding in either way or either place would be great. And thank you, John, for all your effort and your presentation today.
Thank you, Barrett. Hope everyone has a good day.